Hi, my name is Jeremy Meeks, and I'm the director of the Chicago Course on Preaching for the Charles Simeon Trust. And today we're going to talk about the Book of Ecclesiastes, because getting started right will help us cut it straight. You know, the Book of Ecclesiastes is my favorite book of the Bible. It's a strange book. It's an uncomfortable book, but it is a supremely helpful book if we'll just pay attention to what the writer has to tell us. It helps us to ask and get some kind of answer about the biggest questions of life. What are we doing here? Does anything matter? And as long as we're willing to pay attention and listen closely, then this book will help us to live the best we can in a world that doesn't always make sense. Let's talk about context. First, about the context of all of the wisdom literature books in general. These books are all amazing, but they're also all very different. The late British commentator Derek Kidner compared the books of Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes to three different kinds of houses. The book of Proverbs is the grand house, the prosperous house. The book of Job is the wrecked house. And the book of Ecclesiastes is the decaying house. And I think these are incredibly apt descriptions of these houses. Proverbs, being the grand, the prestigious house, is the house where most of us live if we live anywhere in wisdom literature. It is a rather beautiful and true perspective on the world. Live well, things seem to tend to go well. And that's the way we like to think about the world, and that's the way the world often is. The book of Job, being the wrecked house, is a different perspective on that theme. It says that you can live well, but sometimes everything falls apart and everything seems to be in ruins. The book of Ecclesiastes, being the decaying house, is my favorite because it helps us to understand that everything was once beautiful, and that beauty still remains, but that beauty is also passing away. And whatever isn't exactly what it used to be. So who is Ecclesiastes written to? The answer is everyone. Believer, unbeliever alike. The book addresses all human beings everywhere. Anyone who's willing to listen long enough to receive the wisdom from the author. It's one of the greatest things about all of the wisdom literature in the Bible. They have a timeless character, which makes them rather unique amongst the collection of all the books we have in the Bible. Now, in particular, it's the people of God, and it's addressed to them, but it is in a very general way. The author is giving God's truth to God's people as long as they'll listen, which raises an interesting question. Who's the author? You know, if you want to get 10 preachers arguing, just throw that question into the midst of them, and you'll get about 42 different answers. It seems rather simple at first. Chapter 1, verse 1, the words of the preacher, the son of David, the king in Jerusalem. That sure sounds potentially like Solomon. This is a book of wisdom, therefore wisdom, Solomon. That's the way this goes. If only it were that simple. There's actually kind of two speakers in the book of Ecclesiastes. There's a narrator, and then there's this guy called the preacher. In a book like Proverbs, Solomon will actually call himself Solomon. Here we never get that. And though it is read as if it were Solomon, there are things that at least lead us to be suspicious of such a thing. First of all, he says in verse 12 of chapter 1, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem, as if he is king no longer, but we don't know of any time like that in Solomon's life. He also says that he is more wise in verse 16 than those who have come before him. But Solomon was the second king of Israel. I think that the best way to understand this is that it is Solomon-like. It's a fictional character, somebody who has all the access to all the things you could ever possibly want, and yet still, at the end of the day, comes to a conclusion that a poor man could have figured out. The author of the book is known as the preacher, and so that's what I'll call him through our time here together. The preacher isn't exactly one who is a proclaimer necessarily, but one who gathers. In this sense, one who gathers people or information. And I think in this case it's both. He's gathering all who will listen to share with them what he has gathered about wisdom. But interestingly, what he has gathered is in his hands kind of like sand. He holds it loosely. He knows what he's talking about, but he knows that he doesn't have an exact command of this, because nobody does. And just like sand, the tighter you grip it, the more it kind of slips through your fingers. But this is what he has to share with us as long as we're going to listen. Let's talk about structure. Interestingly, in this book, there is a lot of complicated stuff when it comes to structure, mainly because if you ask 10 experts about the book, you're going to get about 32 different answers. It's a thing that you've got to get comfortable with when you come to Ecclesiastes. So my main piece of advice is embrace the weirdness. That doesn't mean that there's no structural details to this book. So let's think about the big structure to begin with. The book begins as if it's a one-man play, and a narrator walks out on stage. And this narrator in chapter 1, verses 1 through 12, tells us about the preacher. He gives us who he is, his main conviction about life in verse 2. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And he gives us his principal question, which the preacher will return to time and again in verse 3. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? Which is a good question. And it's the question the preacher will ask. And the reason why he asks that is in the rest of this introduction. And it's essentially this. In chapter 1, verses 4 to 7, it's because the world doesn't care. And in verses 8 through 11, it's because we don't last. With that, we then launch in to the preacher himself in this one-man play, speaking to us personally, the audience, about what he has found. And that section runs until an outro in chapter 12, verses 9 to 14. It's at this point that the preacher, if you're imagining the one-man play, maybe goes to the background and the narrator comes out and speaks to the audience one last time. Here is probably the most important verse, at least the most well-known verse in the collection, chapter 12, verse 13, which says, "The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man." It's a true verse. It's a good verse, and a verse that you and I need to take to heart. But just let me encourage you to not use that verse to wreck what the preacher is saying in the middle. Too often, it's the temptation to get stuck in maybe a weird section of what the preacher is saying, and then say, well, but here's what we know. Quote chapter 12, verse 13. And then essentially say, so let's go have a nice day. Fear God. Just know that when you do that, what you're saying is everything I just shared with you from the preacher in the middle is useless because you should just fear God. You also need to know that the narrator, as he's commenting about the preacher, says something very interesting about him, which you and I do need to keep in mind as we struggle through the middle section. He says this in chapter 12, verses 9 and 10. He says, "Besides being wise, the preacher also taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs with great care. The preacher sought to find words of delight, and uprightly he wrote words of truth." This is what the narrator says about the preacher. So you should say nothing less than what the narrator thinks about the preacher. Well, what about that part in the middle? How is it that we're going to get from chapter 1, verse 12 to chapter 12, verse 8, as we essentially just watch the preacher in this one-man play speak to us, the audience? Well, it's going to be a challenge. But there are some things that can be helpful to us. I would encourage you to think mainly about themes as you try to divide sections of this book, where you're going to start and where you're going to stop. For example, in chapter 1, beginning in verse 12, when the writer starts actually saying something to us, and running to the end of chapter 2, you see a series of things that are vanity. The preacher is trying a variety of things and comes to the end of the conclusion. Says, I only kind of know this one thing, that we should enjoy life the best we can. Because he can't figure out the difficulties on the merry-go-round of life. Or take chapter 7, at least verses 1 to 13, which talks about the complexities of death. In verses 1 through 6, it talks about the gift of death. And then in verse 7 to 13, it talks about what you and I are supposed to do until we die. But then beginning in verse 14, he's talking about something different. So as you read through the book, and you should read through the book over and over and over again, enjoying the book as much as you can, try to figure out where the author is shifting from one topic to another, from one theme to another. And let me just tell you that sometimes it's going to be pretty clear, and sometimes it's going to be rather difficult. And the commentaries will be of no help to you whatsoever. They'll only lead you to confusion, in the sense that they're guessing just as much as you are, and they all disagree with each other. So, benefit from them as much as you can, but do your own work. Try to live with the preacher, appreciating his wisdom, and trying to see what he has to say to you and your people today. Let's talk about some key themes in the book of Ecclesiastes. This book is full of themes, and we've already seen how themes can help us figure out what sections of the book to preach. But there are a couple overarching themes that are very important to take into account. First of all, let's get back to that idea of the decaying house. One of the biggest themes in the book of Ecclesiastes is the idea that life swings between two dramatically different poles, never quite reaching either. Sometimes it's more in flux and sometimes it's less, but life is always on a trajectory towards one of these two poles. The first pole is life is seemingly meaningless. It's very dark, it's sad, it's tragic, and nearly useless. Thankfully, it never quite reaches that pole. The other pole is that life is amazing. It's a delight, it's a joy, and we should embrace every moment. Carpe diem. And as nice as it would be to live at that pole, it only ever swings close to that pole before swinging back towards the other one. And again, as the text moves, sometimes in the middle of a single section, it will swing between these two poles just like our lives. Perhaps the biggest theme in the book is going back to that term, vanity. Now, if you want to really start a fight, just ask people what vanity means. The answer is, we're not really sure. So don't try and nail it down too tight. There's all kinds of words that people have tried to put in place of vanity. The one that I think is completely irresponsible is the idea of meaningless. It's not meaningless. It might seem meaningless, but the author is being coy, he's being cagey, and he's being interesting. Life is seemingly meaningless, perhaps, but other words that we use to try and understand this concept, like smoke, vapor, breath, mystery, all kind of get nearer to this idea that the world is, and here's my favorite word for this idea of vanity, enigmatic. It's strange. It seems to be so full of meaning and yet devoid at the same time. It gets back to the idea that the preacher has gathered wisdom, but he holds it loosely because if he squeezes too tight, it'll fall through his fingers. Life is, in a real sense, strange because, like that decaying house, the world is both bitter and sweet. The world is both joyful and sad. The world is both incredibly meaningful. And yet, we get the sense that while it is meaningful, it doesn't mean everything. And living in that tension is the story of every one of our lives, and it's the story of the entire Bible. If we can just kind of get a grip on who God is in the midst of this, then we can come to grips with the fact that He is God and we are not, and that's okay. Because this is a God who has been faithful to His people, which the writer seems to understand from beginning to end. The preacher has no qualms about who God is. His qualms are about living in a world that doesn't quite make sense, that is vanity, that is enigmatic. And if we can't embrace that, then we'll never be comfortable. We'll never be able to rest, and we'll never be able to trust in God. But if we can, then we can learn to live as best we can, as wisely as we can, as people who live under the authority of the one who's in charge of it all. Let's talk about gospel connections. In this book, you come to embrace the fact that Jesus is the Savior of the world. And that's really good news, but it doesn't solve all of our problems in life. Here in this book, my greatest encouragement to you is not to run to Jesus to solve the problem that Ecclesiastes raises. Remember that the work of doing theological reflection and connecting to the gospel comes after we've done the work of trying to understand what the author is trying to tell his audience. In other words, our gospel connection work is to be done in light of what the author is trying to say, which should then be a way to help us understand what we should say. But if we're saying something that the author's not saying, then why preach the book of Ecclesiastes to begin with? Let me give you an example of how this gospel connection work should actually deepen what the author is saying and not just erase it. Let's take the best known section of this book. By far one of my favorite things to preach in the book, Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 to 15. I call this section Doing Time. If anybody's got any understanding of the book of Ecclesiastes, they've probably heard this, but probably preached in the wrong kind of way. It begins in verses 1 through 8, declaring that there is a time for everything. But then in verses 9 through 12, it talks about the problem of eternity before turning in verses 13 to 15 to the gift of now. And I am convinced that what the author is trying to tell his people is that we, as finite creatures trapped in time, ought to live as faithfully as we can before the face of an infinite God. Everything starts with this idea that there is a time for everything. It's a beautiful poem, but it's a problematic poem in this sense. If there's a time for everything, then there's a time for everything, which sounds self-evidently true, and it is. The problem is that you and I don't control time. In fact, we are victims of time, if anything. We don't necessarily do time. Time does us. We're like a leaf floating on a river. We don't get to control everything, which would be fine if all of our times were good, but we know that our times have not always been good, and while our time might be good now, who knows what tomorrow brings. So, there is a time for everything, but that's a problem. It wouldn't be a problem if we knew eternity, if we knew everything. But this gets us into the second movement of the passage. In verses 9 through 12, the problem of eternity. The problem is that God knows everything, and He puts in our hearts the desire to know everything and also the inability, which, to be honest, seems kind of like a jerk move on God's part. And it might be, but it all depends on one question. Who's the God that we're talking about? Well, this is one place where the Christian has much more knowledge than the preacher, and thus has much more reason to trust in this God. Granted, the preacher has lots of reason too. God has been faithful to His people through time. But you and I, who know of Jesus Christ, have much more reason to trust that the God who does everything perfectly in His own time governs all of our times as well. For example, in the book of Galatians, chapter 4, verses 4 and 5, Paul says this, "But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth His Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons." God, who makes everything beautiful in His own time, according to the writer, according to the preacher in Ecclesiastes, also makes everything beautiful in His own time in the death of His Son. What's most fascinating about our lives is that God never gives us a philosophical answer for why we go through hard times or why we go through good times. Instead, He gives us the death of His Son that was born in the perfection of God's time. And what this does is not necessarily makes our times better or worse, but it does norm the times in which we live. Because if in the perfection of God's own time exists a time for Him to redeem people like you and me through the death of His own Son, then maybe, just maybe, and by maybe I mean absolutely, there is the goodness of God's plan in the tough times in our lives. That leads to the gift of now at the end. We realize that we're finite creatures and that God is infinite, and therefore we can live knowing that we will not last, but whatever God does will last forever. This is a way to see the gospel of Jesus Christ motivate us to live as finite creatures faithfully, though trapped in time, before an infinite God. But there are some rather poor ways that we could connect to the gospel in a text like this that I'll share with you. For example, we could say there is a time for everything. A time for everything, including a time to get saved. And so you need to believe in the Lord Jesus Christ today, because this is a good time, which happens to be absolutely true, and also have absolutely nothing to do with what the preacher is talking about. So we can talk well about Jesus, motivate people to accept the Lord Jesus Christ today, but actually completely ignore what the author is saying. Or, for example, we could say the eternity that we have placed in our hearts by God is a longing for Jesus Christ. And Jesus, in the Gospel of John, has gone away to make a place for us, an eternal place. And one day we will go be with Him. Which is true, but happens to have the downside of saying the exact opposite thing of what the preacher is saying in the text. Eternity is not a pleasant, comforting thing. It's a problem because we don't understand it. And Christians today don't understand it either. I'm very happy that Jesus has gone away to make a place for me. But I still live trapped in the ravages of time today. And while I have hope for tomorrow, I don't live in tomorrow. So eternity is still my problem. And it's still your problem. So you have to help people live today. Don't just have them escape because Jesus went away somewhere. Or perhaps most poorly, we could also say that the perception of the preacher is off because he's not a Christian. As finite creatures, what the author is encouraging us to do is live faithfully before God and enjoy life. And we should say, perhaps, that because he's not a Christian, that God's gift is not enjoyment and doing good. God's gift is His Son. So we should not enjoy and we should not do good. We should accept Jesus. Again, if that's going to be your gospel connection, which is easy, just know that whatever the preacher is saying is irrelevant to us, so we shouldn't preach Ecclesiastes. I will be honest. Doing legitimate gospel connection in the book of Ecclesiastes will stretch you to your limit. But it is significantly easier if you connect to the gospel in light of what you are convinced the preacher is trying to tell us, his audience. If you start there and don't just start from some way to get to Jesus, then you will be able to preach this book in a way that is incredibly powerful and actually pushes the message of the preacher toward your people in a way that is gospel saturated and actually gets people to live well in this really decaying house that is both beautiful and difficult at the same time. In conclusion, the book of Ecclesiastes is necessary to live the best we can in a world that isn't quite what we wished it would be. A world that we both appreciate and loathe at the same time. A world that gives us hints that maybe it wasn't always this way, and hopefully it won't always be this way. It's a book that will be incredibly relevant both for new Christians seeking to figure out what it means to live under the authority of God, or old Christians who are struggling to end well, or unbelievers who are wondering why the world seems so great and so terrible at the same time. My encouragement to you is to dig into the book, to enjoy it as much as you can, not just to get the message out of the book, but to embrace the challenges of living in this world. The fact of the matter is, living ain't easy, but Ecclesiastes can help us do it the best we can. So I hope that our time together has helped you get started in order to cut it straight.